if you're new to acrylic painting, you might wonder which color should I buy to paint with, because when you go to the store or you shop online, you get overwhelmed by all the colors that you can buy. To begin with, black and white paint are very useful to have, of course, because with only black and white you already can make fantastic paintings, because the most difficult part in painting, to be honest, is getting the tonal values right, those are the values from dark to light. So when you want to practice painting, it isn't that weird to start with only black and white paint. And it might seem boring, but it is very nice to start simple, and simple is difficult enough. That way you get used to mixing paint and using the paint, and you don't have to bother with mixing colors. But of course colors are nice, and if you want to work with colors, when you look at the color wheel, you want to be able to make all the main colors that you can see on the color wheel, of course. When you can make all the main colors, you can also make the darker variations and the lighter variations and the more saturated and less saturated variations. Now, one way to do this is working with the three primary colors. And the three primary colors with painting, because with painting we work with pigments, are primary yellow, primary magenta and primary cyan. With these three colors you can make all other colors on the color wheel. With yellow and magenta you can make the oranges and the red, because that magenta, that looks a little bit odd maybe, because it has a little bit of a purplish tone to it, feeling to it. But when you mix magenta and yellow you can make red. So often we are taught at primary school that the primary colors are red, yellow and blue, but most of the times they show us the wrong color because we work with pigments and they behave in a certain way. Long story, but I already made a video about the three primaries and that you can make all other colors with them. So you could start with the three primaries and white, titanium white, because it is an opaque color. And a black paint, oxide black for instance. And this color set has some benefits, it also has some downsides. The benefits are that when you're completely new to painting, you will get a good feeling, a good sense about for color mixing. You learn the relations of all the colors in the color wheel very easily with only primary magenta, yellow and cyan. The downsides are that, for instance, when I need a lot of red, then I always have to mix magenta with yellow to make red, and sometimes it's a lot of work to mix the right color with only three colors. That's more work than when you have more colors. Then you can get faster to the color you want, easier also. And another downside is that these three primary colors aren't that opaque. So for instance, cyan is relatively a transparent color. That means that if you paint with it, it doesn't cover that well and you see the previous layer shine through. And same goes for the primary yellow, isn't that opaque as well. And magenta as well is a very transparent color. And with transparent colors, if you want to cover something, sometimes you have to go over it several times, and that can be a downside. So getting to the right color can be a bit more difficult, and you have the problem of the opaqueness. Then I'll show you another possibility. Everyone has their own preferences and taste, but a set of colors that I like are primary yellow or cadmium yellow light. Cadmium yellow light looks similar to primary yellow, but it is more opaque and also way more expensive because it is an expensive pigment and it's very toxic, so take care that you don't eat it or avoid skin contact as much as you can. So we have a neutral yellow, that's the whole point of this. Then we get to the next colors, and then I personally like to have just a red, pyrrole red. I like pyrrole red, it's a sort of a neutral red, it's relatively neutral so to speak, but it's just that sort of red that you can use a lot of the times. And besides, I have a magenta for some cases when I want to make vivid purples. For blue, I mostly use ultramarine blue and cyan. And cyan, you can as well use phthalo blue for cyan, because cyan is a lighter version of phthalo blue. They've added white. Cyan or phthalo blue is a very neutral blue, and ultramarine is handy when you want to make very bright purples. You can mix ultramarine with magenta, you get very bright purples. And in addition to the ultramarine, I also use burnt umber, because when I mix burnt umber and ultramarine, I get a very dark color that looks like black. So that's useful for a dark color. But also I can make very nice gray colors. So that's that. And then of course titanium white, and I also have black. I use oxide black. In general, you don't use black that much in painting, except for when you make tonal value studies with only black and white paint. So it's a very useful color, and I also use it to tone my canvases when I want to make my gesso gray. As said before, I want to be able to mix all these colors in their most pure form, so that's one thing. And if I have a primary yellow, so that's a yellow that hasn't got a bias towards orange or towards green, but because every color can have a bias towards another color. If I have a neutral yellow and a neutral red, I get nice vivid orange, for instance, if I want that. And of course, if I add more yellow, I get more an orange yellow color, you see. So of course you can make all kinds of variations in between, but you know that. So then I have this range of the color wheel already, because I have yellow, I have a more orangey red yellow, and then I have orange, and here I have red, and then I have magenta. That's a sort of color that looks a little bit as if it is leaning already to the purple side. Well, then I can make with magenta and with ultramarine blue, I can make a very bright, vivid purple, like this, you see? And I can choose, this is more of a red, purplish color, but of course, when I add more ultramarine blue, I can make it more of a neutral purple, you see? And of course, if I add even more of the ultramarine, I get a very, blue purple. It's almost ultramarine already. So you see, so that covers these two colors cover this whole part of the color wheel already. Then of course, with a little bit ultramarine and a little bit cyan, for instance, I can make a blue that is in between ultramarine and cyan. So I get something like this. And then I have cyan, and cyan is a relatively neutral blue. But when I add a little bit of yellow, I get a very bright green, as you can see. Now this one leans a little bit towards blue. But if I add more yellow, it will become a more yellow green, of course, and you get the idea. You can make all kinds of variations in it. But now another important part of this whole thing. What I did here all the time was I only mixed two primary colors. In this case, for instance, I theoretically mixed magenta and yellow, because this color I can make because this red I can make myself by mixing magenta and yellow. Then I get a red like this. And so this red contains magenta and a little bit of yellow, and we have the pure yellow. So when I mix them together, I get a very vivid secondary color. Same goes for the magenta and the ultramarine. Ultramarine is a color that consists of cyan, of a very neutral blue with a little bit of magenta. So it is a purplish blue. And when I mix that with magenta, I only mix magenta and cyan, theoretically. So then I get a very bright purples like this. Same goes for the green. The green only consists of cyan and yellow. Whenever you add a third primary color, so for instance, here I had a green that only contained cyan and yellow, but if I add a little bit of magenta, you see what happens? The green gets duller, gets less vivid. So that's all. I've told all of this in the video about complementary colors. Is very important to know these kind of things. And if I add more, I can get to a point that the color becomes a sort of neutral gray or brownish a little bit. Like this. You see, when I add white, you can clearly see there's not much of green left over in this color anymore. So if I add a little bit more, even, you see, oh, it's a little bit too much, but you get to a point where it gets gray, you see? So all the time when I mix two primaries, I get a very vivid secondary color. But as soon as I add a third primary, so in this case the orange, it only contained magenta and yellow. If I add a little bit of blue, you will see that the orange gets dull. You see, it gets less saturated. It's not that vivid anymore. Now we get to the fun part. Most colors in life aren't that vivid as what we saw before here. Most colors in life contain a reasonable amount of gray. So if I want to mix a green, for instance, when I see a lot of trees and I want to mix green, then I can mix cyan and primary yellow, but I get a very bright, vivid green. And we almost never see a green like this in reality. It's way too green. It's a nice color, that's not the problem, but it's way too green. So what can I do? I can dull the color by adding a third primary, but since I have ultramarine in my set of colors, I can get more quickly to the color I want, because when I add yellow to this ultramarine, I get a less saturated green color. You see? This is a way more natural green. It looks a little bit ugly, so maybe on this palette, like this, but it is a color that you can encounter in reality. And why is this color dull? It is because I mixed only two colors. I mixed ultramarine and I mixed yellow, but remember, this ultramarine contains two primaries theoretically. It is a cyan with magenta added. That makes for an ultramarine color. See, I can show. If I have a little bit of cyan over here, I'll add a little bit of magenta. I can get very close to ultramarine. You see? It's not quite there yet. A little bit more. So like this. You see, that's the idea. This color contains two primaries already, and when I mix it with yellow, I mix three primaries, and that's why I get a dull color. That's what I showed you over here. So that's a shortcut, and that's why most painters have two variations of each color on their palette. To give another example, when I want to make a less vivid purple, not like this, but less saturated, I take a red that already leans towards yellow, because this red I can make. Yeah, so if I put this red here, you can see I can make the same sort of color by mixing magenta with a little bit of how you call it? Yellow. So I get the same red. So this red contains two primaries. It is magenta with yellow, and that's theoretically speaking, of course. So when I mix this red with cyan and not with ultramarine, I get a very dull, maybe I can't even get a purple, because it is almost the exact complementary color of red, that's cyan. So it is, you hardly can make a purple with this. If I add a little bit of white, you can see it's very gray. It is a little bit purplish, but it is very gray. And again, that is because this red and that cyan are so far apart on the color wheel that cyan is a pure color, but that red contains yellow and magenta. But if I want to make it less extreme, of course I can do a little bit of that red with a little bit of ultramarine, and ultramarine by itself contains a little bit of magenta as well. So this is getting a little bit closer to purple, you see, but as well it has a little bit of a tendency towards brown already because it gets dulled. So, and maybe that also explains why sometimes you don't get the right colors you thought you would get. If you were taught in your childhood that this is primary red and this is blue, and you want to make a purple and you mix this red with this blue, you get a very ugly purple. So the last thing I wanted to show you is I've got some ultramarine here and I've got some burnt umber. When I mix those two together, I get a very, very dark color. You see? There are several ways to make dark colors, but I like this one, and that's mainly because of this reason. Here we have a very dark color, so I don't need black necessarily. And the nice thing about this is when I add white to this, of course, I get gray. Yeah, so that's logical. So first let me have a look. If I add white to this one, you see, I get a relatively neutral gray. A very nice gray color. I'll add some more. You can see maybe even better. You can make it lighter, darker, of course, you know that. You see, this is relatively neutral. Eh? And if I add some white to this one, I of course get the same color because it was the same mixture. But I can choose to add a little bit more ultramarine, and you can adjust as much as you want. But now I also get a gray color, but that is a cooler gray color, you see? And it's logical, it contains more ultramarine. And the other way is make it a warmer gray when I add, make it a little bit lighter, when I add a little bit more of the burnt umber, I get a warmer gray. So, very easy to use these colors to make simple common grays. And of course in life we encounter all kinds of grays, so I can also add a little bit of red to this one and I get another gray, but you get the idea. It's very easy to make nice grays with ultramarine blue and burnt umber. So that was a long story, but I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, see you next time.